Welcome to today's program with Judge Michael Luttig on the rule of law and the role of business in sustaining democracy. I'm Suzanne Spaulding. I'm Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions project. Today's program follows a half-day summit, which we held here at CSIS a couple of days ago on April 30th, the day before Law Day, on the role of business in sustaining democracy. And I encourage all of you who were not able to watch it at that time to look it up at csis.org. It was a terrific conversation. And that program and today's program are made possible by the generous support of Thinkubator. These programs are part of our Civics at Work initiative, which we launched to address the urgent need, really the national security imperative, to strengthen the civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic engagement of Americans at all ages, including adults. Businesses are among the most trusted institutions, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer and other surveys. And they have an important role to play in ensuring an informed and engaged citizenry. The goal of Civics at Work is to encourage businesses to become more engaged in this work of sustaining our democracy by being advocates for civics education, by engaging their own workforces in ways that build these important skills and knowledge and engagement, and by supporting civics activities in their own communities. Democracy is neither invincible nor inevitable. We cannot hope to sustain it if we don't teach it and practice it. And this is why I am so grateful for the work of our co-hosts today for this event, the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia, on whose advisory board I have the honor of serving. As we will hear, the Karsh Institute charts an action-oriented path towards realizing democracy in both practice and in principle. We are delighted to be joined today by the Karsh Institute's Executive Director, Melody Barnes. Melody has dedicated more than 25 years to putting democracy into action by crafting public policy. As a public servant and as a leader. She was President Obama's Domestic Policy Council Director and Assistant to the President. She also served as Executive Vice President of the Center for American Progress and the Chief Counsel to Senator Ted Kennedy on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Melody is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and University of Michigan Law School. In addition to her important role at the Karsh Institute, she is also the J. Wilson Newman Professor of Governance at UVA's Miller Center of Public Affairs, a distinguished fellow at UVA's School of Law, where Judge Luttig and I were classmates, and co-founder of the domestic policy strategy firm MB2 Solutions. She serves on the boards of directors of several corporate, nonprofit, and philanthropic organizations. And it's been so inspiring to work with Melody on these democracy issues. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome her today to CSIS to introduce our guest. Melody?
Suzanne, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I have to tell you and Judge Luttig, I'm thrilled to be here today because today's program is really well aligned with the Karsh Institute's mission to understand and to invigorate and to defend the foundations of democracy. When we think about all of our work, robust interdisciplinary scholarship and research and teaching, our commitment to engaging programs that inform the public and policymakers, our purpose is to create a future in which democracy's aspirations and its reality are aligned. We're honored to partner with you and with CSIS because it's one of the premier research organizations in the country. And hosting today's event, we think, brings an important perspective and set of issues in front of the American people. And it's certainly illustrative of CSIS's vision for a safer and more prosperous world. My assumption is, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago, Suzanne, that we all share a common understanding that democracy is not inevitable. Rather, self-government requires a well-informed public committed to robust democratic institutions and practices and the culture that makes them all possible. If we lose or if we fail to develop the civic muscles that allow us to meaningfully engage in public life, the foundation of our democracy suffers and the consequences are dire for all of us. Today's conversation will explore the pivotal leadership role the private sector must play in building, sustaining, and enhancing civic life. The health of the body politic requires business leaders to help reinvigorate civic awareness and engagement, as well as commitment to the rule of law. For that purpose, I can't imagine two better interlocutors than the two of you. I admire both of you for your tireless commitment to the values underpinning American democracy, and in particular, the rule of law. I want to start out by introducing Judge Michael Luttig, who recently joined the Karsh Institute as a Distinguished Fellow in Law and Democracy, which is an inaugural position co-sponsored by the Karsh Institute and UVA School of Law's Karsh Center for Law and Democracy. A 1981 graduate of the law school, we are thrilled to welcome you back to the University of Virginia. Judge Luttig served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit for 15 years from 1991 until 2006. Before his appointment to the federal bench by President George H.W. Bush, he served as Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice and as counselor to the Attorney General of the United States. From 1981 until 1982, he was Assistant Counsel to the President during the administration of President Ronald Reagan. From 1982 until 1983, he was a law clerk to then Judge Antonin Scalia of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and then a law clerk and special assistant to U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. After retiring from the bench, Judge Luttig was Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Boeing until 2020, and he currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the National Constitution Center and is counselor and special advisor to the Coca-Cola Company. As I mentioned, the judge will be in conversation with you, Suzanne, and as you mentioned a few minutes ago, you are the Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project here at CSIS. Like Judge Luttig, Suzanne is also a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law. In fact, I believe the two of you were classmates, and you went on to serve with distinction as Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, where your responsibilities included protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, including election infrastructure. Suzanne has extensive experience in the executive branch in both Republican and Democratic administrations and on both sides of the aisle in Congress. And as I mentioned, Suzanne also has private sector experience, serving as a managing partner of the Harbor Group, a principal at the Bingham Consulting Group, and of counsel to Bingham McCutcheon LLP. And of course, we are thrilled beyond measure that you serve on the Karsh Institute Board of Advisors. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Suzanne, for what I know will be a really robust conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, great. Thank you, Melody, and thank you again for co-hosting this important conversation today. Judge Luttig, I cannot thank you enough for finding time somehow to be here with us today. I know that yesterday you were in Philadelphia for a big event. We had on our half-day summit on April 30th, we had the American Bar Association President Mary Smith with us to talk about the rule of law and the role of lawyers. And she mentioned that there was this Law Day event in Philadelphia and that Judge Luttig was going to be speaking there. And I know that, and she noted that you're going to be at another ABA event tomorrow. And here you are with us here in Washington, D.C. today. I suspect this is pretty typical week for you, actually. And so I really want to start there with you. You have obviously made a top priority being a compelling and informed voice to try to educate Americans about our democracy and the concerns that you have and what you see that needs to be done. And so before we even get necessarily into all of that substance, just give us a sense of why, of all the options, and you must have had lots of options in front of you as you made the decision to be involved with the Karsh Institute on Democracy, to co-chair the American Bar Association's Task Force on Democracy with my former boss, Secretary Jay Johnson. Why is this issue so important to you that you're devoting so much of your time and energy to it?
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Melody. And thank you, CSIS and the Karsh Institute. As we all know, American democracy and the rule of law are in peril, and they have been for several years now. When I testified in front of the January 6th committee 2 years ago, I think that my opening line was that a stake was driven through the heart of America's democracy on January 6, 2021, and today, 2 years ago, that democracy is on a knife's edge. It's hard even to believe it, but 2 years thence from that testimony, our democracy and the rule of law are in extremis. America's democracy and the rule of law are the heart and soul of America. And we've come now to the point where millions and millions of Americans, and most troublingly younger Americans, are questioning whether democracy is the best form of government. And there are frightening statistics where many of those American citizens say that no, it's not, and that they would prefer another form of government. And with that has come a decline in the respect for the rule of law. America's democracy and the rule of law are the reasons that America has been the beacon to the world of freedom for the past almost 250 years. No longer will the world look to America as that beacon of freedom, I'm afraid. And if someday they will return to see the United States of America as that beacon of freedom, I'm afraid that day it will be long in coming. But these times are testing America's commitment to democracy and to the rule of law. And the proverbial jury is still out. And every one of us has a role to play in protecting, preserving, and defending our democracy and the rule of law. Every single person in America, every single organization in America, like CSIS, like the Karsh Institute, and the many other democracy organizations and institutions, never before in our history has anyone ever thought that they would be called upon by their country to defend her democracy and rule of law. But that's where we are now. And it's really now or never. If all of us do not support our democracy and our rule of law today and in the months and only several years ahead, we're going to look up one day and we won't have a democracy and we won't have the rule of law, because they only exist because Americans for almost 250 years have been committed to those two. If Americans decide that they don't want democracy and they don't want the rule of law, then that's what it will be.
Yeah, that's inherent in our system. And I think one of the reasons that we've certainly seen that might lie behind this decline in democracy is the fact that we sort of stopped teaching about our democracy in many ways. We've allowed that civic knowledge to atrophy. And, you know, a lot of people date that to Sputnik and the rush towards STEM education, the recognition that STEM is a national security imperative, which it is. But we forgot that civics education is also a national security imperative. And what we've had then is for many, many years, National Assessment of Educational Progress tests that show only 1 in 5, roughly 22% at the most recent testing, of our 8th graders are proficient in civics. And that's year after year, we're turning out these students that don't understand democracy. And what we've seen here at CSIS and have been looking at is how our adversaries take advantage of and exploit that vulnerability and weakness of our own making. And they very much lean into and push this narrative that democracy is not just flawed and needing reform, which it is, but that it's irrevocably broken. And the individual is powerless to bring about change through the system and through peaceful means. And that there's more that divides us than unites us. And our assessment has been that the best way to pre-bunk or debunk that narrative is to teach civics, is to teach people about the system and how it works. But we have a lot of sort of remedial work to do, right? The K through 12 investment's important and essential, but we got to reach adults. And in particular on this notion of the rule of law. You and I and Melody, trained as a lawyer, we're all trained as lawyers. The rule of law, we get that concept, it rolls off our tongue. For most Americans, I'm not sure, do you think they have a good understanding of what we mean when we say the rule of law and how it applies in their own lives?
No, I don't, Suzanne, not today. And the reasons for that are obvious to me, and that's because they are being bombarded with conflicting information, but more importantly, conflicting views on both democracy and the rule of law. It's, you know, I think I maybe said in my testimony on this that or if not in subsequent speeches, that we no longer agree on anything in America, let alone do we agree on the fundamental values and principles on which this country was founded and on which it has led the world for the past 250 years. We don't agree on the law. We don't agree on who should be bound by the law that does exist. We don't agree on what's fact and what's not fact, what's false and what's true. I've never even read about a time in our history when there was so much confusion. And that confusion has been sown by many people intentionally, not just our foreign adversaries, but our domestic friends. But to the point you made about CIS and the mischief by our adversaries, I've read just with great interest all the work and much of the writings that you've been doing about that, just for my own edification, because I haven't had time to understand that threat from our enemies, but I do now, and I appreciate your point that we adults have to be aware of that and defeat that adversarial effort. But at the same time, I certainly appreciate your point that we have to educate the younger generation. In fact, that brings to mind something I said to some group somewhere, that it's too late to educate the adults now. We are in the fight of our lives for our country, for our democracy, and for our rule of law. It's too late to educate the warriors in that fight. We were remiss in not educating those warriors beginning 25 or 30 years ago. And I see the failure of education as having begun approximately 25, 30, 35 years ago. That's unfortunately our legacy.
Well, I don't disagree with you that we would be in much better shape today had we sustained a more rigorous approach to making sure that all Americans understood the foundations of our democracy. I'm not sure I agree that it's too late to reach adults, and clearly the work we've embarked upon is out of hope that businesses and others can step up and strengthen the civic knowledge and skills and engagement of our adult community and in the workplace and in their communities, with an emphasis on empowering individuals to make changes in their communities, to make their communities better. And I want to come to your role in business in addition to your role as a judge and a lawyer, and we'll circle back to that. But I don't want to let this rule of law issue go quite yet, because I'm very concerned that our courts are on a collision course with our political system, with the election. That in addition to the courts having to handle these trials involving the former president, that they are going to get, as they always do, election-related cases that are challenging the processes, for example, of elections in state and local courts all across the country, federal courts, both running up to the election and then most concerningly, potentially in the post-election context. Lawsuits challenging the implementation of the Electoral College Reform Act, for example. I'm wondering how likely you think it is that we find ourselves in another sort of Bush v. Gore situation, where a case comes before the Supreme Court that is effectively going to could determine the outcome of the election, and how much concern you have about that, whether you think the American public will accept a decision that goes against their candidate of choice, and what we could be doing between now and then to mitigate the concerns that you might have.
Well, we've been building to a crescendo to that very place for several years now, and I've been speaking out at every turn. But to set the landscape for all of us, the former president and his allies and supporters attempted to overturn the 2020 presidential election and to remain in power despite the will and the vote of the American people, for the first time in American history, preventing the peaceful transfer of power. 3.5 years since that fateful day, the president and his then allies and now his Republican Party are continuing that war, if you will, on American democracy and the rule of law. And that's a reference to what I said in Congress 2 years ago. I said that the former president, his allies and supporters had instigated a war on America's democracy, and that some number of those people were determined to prosecute that war to its catastrophic end. Again, that was 2 years ago. Now it's plain that they those same people, and now with reinforcements, are determined to prosecute that war to its catastrophic end. And what do we see now? For the first time in American history, a president has been charged with grave crimes, grave offenses against the United States of America. I've said publicly many times that with the possible exception of treason, the effort of the former president to overturn the 2020 election and remain in power is one of, if not the single gravest offense against the United States of America that a sitting president could commit. And of course, he and his supporters have fought the prosecution of the former president for those grave offenses for 3+ years now. And finally, it has made its way into the federal court system, as well as has other charges against the president made their way into the state court systems. It's a spectacle. It's an embarrassment to the nation what's going on today in our courts at the instance and behest of the former president. I've spoken out several times recently, criticizing the former president for his utter disrespect, not just for the courts and the court system in America, but for the individual judges. Suzanne, never before in American history has any person, let alone a president of the United States of America, said even one thing that the former president has said about the courts, and to the individual judges that Donald Trump has. He is attempting to delegitimize the federal court system in the United States. It's evident. And he's succeeding with many, many people. So how have the courts responded? Well, in my view, the courts have been paralyzed, and understandably paralyzed, but not inexcusably paralyzed. The courts, just like the rest of Americans, they have to stand up now. They have to affirm what they believe and what they do not believe about America and our democracy and rule of law. And if all of us and all of them refuse to stand up, then Donald Trump will prevail over the institutions of American law and democracy. It's just that simple. Another way I've phrased it recently was that Donald Trump is in a standoff with the federal judiciary and the courts of the United States. And as of this moment, I don't know which will prevail in that standoff. That's about as precarious a position that the rule of law could be in, and the founders of our nation, the framers of our Constitution, they feared most demagoguery in our public officials, and demagoguery in our public discourse, and this was a thoughtful, educated based upon all of the great thinkers and philosophers of civilization, that by demagoguery they meant public leaders who would appeal to the citizenry or the populace based upon their irrational emotions rather than their reason, and therefore lead that populace into what would be in effect a revolution against America herself. I will not say today that that's what we're witnessing, but I will say that many of the most thoughtful, most brilliant thinkers and writers in this country have written that that's exactly what's happening today.
Well, and I know that you come to these issues not from a place of partisanship. You, as long as I've known you, have been a conservative Republican who cares deeply about this country. And yet, these discussions around strengthening our democracy have become politicized in our polarized and highly charged environment. And it's one of the things that we find, Judge, when we go to talk to businesses about the role they can play in this sort of basic nonpartisan effort of, teaching the nuts and bolts of how our democracy works, why it is important to small businesses, why the rule of law matters to them in being able to enforce breach of contract by vendors, individuals, why it is important that their landlord who fails to provide them a habitable environment because there's no heat can't just decide to ignore the judge's decision against them, against the landlord because they don't like the judge, right? That these are things that matter in their own lives. But as we talk to businesses about their role they can play in this, they are nervous. And so you have the ear of one of the country's biggest companies. Hypothetically speaking, how might you have a conversation with them about the role they can play in helping to sustain our democracy?
Well, Suzanne, of course, what you say is right, but we want to pause and think about it. What you said is that democracy and the rule of law have become, politicized and polarized. Think about that. American democracy and the rule of law, this is not political, and it's certainly not partisan. But many of our public officials have made it such. And it's noteworthy that this is not implied or implicit in what those people are saying. It's explicit. It's express. I just read an article a couple of days ago, I believe out of the state of Washington, where the Washington legislators, some number of them, or the party, I think is the Republican Party, they were explicitly saying that they don't favor democracy. And God help me if I'm misremembering that, but I read it 2 or 3 times to be sure. And that's going on in other pockets around the country. and pockets in increasing number. So the first thing that we must do is explain to the American people and eventually to companies that this is not politics. Because you're exactly right, as the ABA task force is going out to companies to talk to them about American democracy and the rule of law. And we're being met in some quarters with the charge that that effort is political.
Melody, you deal with this as well, because I know the Karsh Institute, like CSIS, is fiercely nonpartisan. It wants to be a big tent and make sure that we can have these conversations with all Americans, and in your case, really all around the world to some degree. Talk a little bit about how you think about this and approach this, and then we'll get to some questions from our audience.
Absolutely. Well, I want to underscore some of the things that the judge was saying. This isn't a partisan issue. And I often say to people when we're engaged in a conversation, particularly given my background, I mean, we've all worked for different administrations. You look at my background and think, oh, is she doing this because she wants to put her thumb on the scale for a particular political party? Like this, we aren't here about party, we're here for democracy. And the way that we've approached this is by, first of all, engaging a range of people, a range of experts like the two of you, who come from different perspectives, and others who come from different ideological perspectives. But what we can all agree on is the importance of the foundational ideas, the importance of the rule of law, these democratic values that undergird the republic that is the United States of America, and the importance of engaging in a nonpartisan fashion to advance that. So you take a look at our advisory board, for example, the importance of bringing Judge Luttig on as a distinguished practitioner fellow for democracy and law, and having him engage with other scholars and other experts at the University of Virginia and across the country on these issues, again, without regard to party. It also is important to us in terms of the focus that we bring to a core set of issues. I mean, one, the importance of democratic institutions and democratic practices. And the fact that if we are also focused on the health of our democratic culture and the impact that has on the vibrancy and robustness of our practices and institutions, that these things will continue to fracture and people will find them frustrating. And we also, I think, in the name of the topic that we're discussing today, we look at the economic and social conditions that make democracy possible. You know, why it is important to engage the private sector, what it means for the private sector itself without the rule of law. And Suzanne, you were ticking through a list of issues. Businesses lose the certainty that they are consistently looking for, the ability to protect their copyright, their patent, their products, their contracts. I mean, the list goes on, but also the challenges that we have when businesses aren't able to recruit individuals who value and are educated in the manner that you were talking about, civic education. What makes America a unique place to do business and to operate within the parameters of the rule of law. So those are many of the issues that we focus on and that we believe are so important, in addition to bringing people together who have different points of view. We can debate our views on healthcare all day long as a policy matter, but the importance of our institutions and their ability to bring us to decisions, to disagree productively and to move forward and build consensus so that the nation advances and so that people feel that democracy works for them. Those are the kinds of things that we consider to be so important.
Great, great. And do we have questions from our public?
From the audience?
Let me
Yeah.
say something.
Yeah, please.
About what Melody just said. What it takes today is courage. There should never have come a time when it would take courage, but courage to support and defend American democracy and the rule of law, courage to stand against the forces that oppose democracy and the rule of law. And of course, what we've witnessed over the past 2 or 3 years, as we all know, is a deafening silence by our so-called leaders on certainly from one party who have refused to utter a single word against what's going on in America today. I think I said in an interview with Judy Woodruff that those people have broken their oath with the American people. But the point is that all it would have taken is for those people and others to speak up. And but to this day, they've refused for various reasons. But all of them, I personally ascribed to either political or moral cowardice. I'm at a loss to think what else could possibly be the reason for their deafening silence in the face of a call from their country to put their country above their partisan politics.
Well, we have several questions, which is wonderful to see people so engaged in this topic. I'll start out, Judge Luttig, question for you. From your judicial perspective, how do you view the role of the private sector in upholding constitutional principles and democratic norms?
That's such an interesting and important question, Melody. For many years, I've wanted to write a statement about the rule of law, and in the past few days, I just finished that statement, and there were 16, 18 points that I made about the rule of law, but one of them, and I for drafting purposes, I cast this as a pledge in support of the rule of law. So on this particular point, I cast it as a pledge to hold all of our public officials and other leaders accountable for protection and preservation of our democracy and the rule of law. So that's a digression. But to your specific question, and I've read your material recently, Suzanne. It's probably no surprise that our business leaders are more respected than our public leaders. But they've yet to hear the call. And many of them are as reticent about involving themselves in the future of America that our own political leaders are. I don't really understand that, and I did have the privilege of working in the private sector for, now for two of the largest companies in America, in fact, around the globe, and I will say they rightly, in the past, have been very reluctant to to thrust themselves into the middle of politics. But to date, they see what's going on as just politics. But to view it that way, they need to understand is to view it politically and their role as political. It's, you know, if you choose to stand silent now, you have made a political choice. And we all know which political choice you've made. Another way of saying that is what I've been trying to explain to the business world is that American democracy and the rule of law transcend politics. And if you don't understand that, then perhaps it's best that you stay silent. But when you stay silent today in corporate world, you're speaking volumes about your politics and your partisan politics. Now, to the more important question, our business community and our corporate community should be leading this effort for the sake of the effort itself. But you know, businesses, of course, you know, they have their 5-year plans, okay, and if it doesn't fit into their 5-year plans, then it's left on the cutting room floor, right? But what I would say to them, and I've begun to say to them, is this should be front and center of your 5-year plan. Every reason that you ever articulate for economic and then financial success in your own organizations, every single one of them is in play on this issue of American democracy and the rule of law. It's all can be summed up in you know, the business world's favorite word, which is stability. So what I would say today is that American democracy and the rule of law are unstable, and the business community's failure to stabilize America's democracy and the rule of law now will redound for years and years to their businesses, and it will not be in a positive way. This is, I mean, when I was in the companies that I've been in, this was just axiomatic. This is not even a point of discussion, let alone debate, right? We stand for stability in the country, in the economy, and in our corporate businesses. And they were pointing to exactly what's unstable today and threatens to be destabilized for years to come, which is our government, our democracy, and our rule of law. It just couldn't be any clearer. And frankly, I know that our business leaders understand that, and we need them now, if ever.
Yeah, very well said. And you know, if you're feeling down at some point and discouraged, and you want to be given, you know, some more hope, go online and look at that panel on April 30th of business leaders who are stepping up. Business leaders from Microsoft and Travelers and organizations like Civic Alliance and Civic Works and the U.S. Chamber, and the work that they are doing to help strengthen and sustain our democracy by educating the public about why it is important and what it's all about. So it is happening, not at the scale it needs to. And thank you for all that you're doing to talk to businesses, but to talk to the American public in the very compelling and passionate way that you do, and for being here with us today. Melody, I'm going to give you the final word.
Well, I cannot thank both of you enough for coming together, for engaging in this conversation today. We have to continue the drumbeat of bringing more eyes and ears to the challenge facing the U.S. and the way the U.S. is situated in the world as we look at the global trends facing democracy. And in particular today, adding voice to why it's so important that the business community be engaged on this issue, lead in this issue, not only for the sake of their own businesses, for the reasons you mentioned, stability, certainty, but also because it's so important for our nation and because we're citizens. And citizen is a verb. It requires our action and our attention. So thank you so much for this program, and thank you to CSIS.
And thank you, Melody, and thank you both for what you do every single day to help strengthen our democracy. I've been watching this flag in our background, and I'm a huge baseball fan, and so I often talk about how a few years ago at a baseball game, singing the national anthem, which I think we should all do, not just have it performed for us, I was struck by the fact that the national anthem starts with a question, can you see, say, can you see that Star-Spangled Banner? And it ends with the same question. It never answers that question. Right? It's, as we know, it was written during the battle, and they saw the flag from across the way at the fort during the War of 1812, and it was flying. And through the night, as the battle was raging, they'd occasionally see it still there. But the battle stopped a while ago, and it's been quiet. And now the dawn is breaking, and the sun is coming up, and they don't know who won. And they ask that question: does the flag still fly over the land of the free and the home of the brave? And I'm struck by the fact that that is the challenge to all of us each and every day. And I am so grateful to the two of you for doing everything you can to make sure that the answer to that question is yes, the republic that we aspire to still stands. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you all for joining us.